This is Andrew from FX Medicine. We thank you so much for your support over the last 2 years. We'd really love to remain clinically relevant to your practice. So if you know of an expert in some area, please let us know. You can contact us on fxmedicine.com.au, Facebook or Twitter. This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining me all the way from the United States is Dr. Lise Alschuler, dear to my heart lady that you are. Lise is a naturopathic doctor with board certification in naturopathic oncology who's been practicing since 1994. She maintains a naturopathic oncology practice out of Naturopathic Specialists, a practice in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Lise works as an independent consultant in the area of practitioner and consumer health education. Lise also received an honorary degree from the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine and the Joseph Pizzorno Founders Award from Bastyr University in the same year. She's the current president of the Oncology Association of Naturopathic Physicians, that's ONC-ANP, and you can learn more about this at drlise.net. Lise is also the executive director of tapintegrative.org, a non-profit educational resource for integrative practitioners. Famously, Lise is the co-author, along with Carolyn Gazella, of The Definitive Guide to Cancer and The Definitive Guide to Thriving After Cancer, both texts of which anybody who wants to care for or just those who wish for the evidence regarding natural medicines and the supportive care of cancer should get and read those. And lastly, she co-created the 5tothrive.plan.com and co-hosts a radio show, 5 to Thrive Live, on the Cancer Support Network about living more healthfully in the face of cancer. And I warmly welcome you back to FX Medicine. Lise, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. I'm delighted to be here with you, Andrew, as always.
Now, we're going to be talking about a subject that is dear to my heart, as I understand is to yours, and that's the pros and cons of coffee.
Yes. Are there any cons?
Well, we'll go through a couple of those purported cons because it's interesting how the research on coffee has done an about face since the early 90s. Coffee was such a bad thing and you couldn't even drink it in pregnancy back then. It was really bad for heart disease, really bad for cancer. And now we've had this complete about face. Yeah,
we really have. And I love it when we can justify our previously thought of as bad habits. That always makes me feel happy. And I think that this research is exciting and it's interesting because it still has not penetrated into the lay public. I still get people that proudly will come into my practice and proudly tell me that they've made really great diet changes, including they've given up coffee. So most people still associate coffee, I think, with, as a bad habit. But as with any bad habit, we can overdo it, of course, but in moderation, it seems to me like the data clearly is indicating it's actually quite a good habit.
And this is what's surprising. I mean, it would have to be the number one herbal addiction in the Western world. I remember an interesting article many years ago called Storm in a Teacup, and I'll maybe go into that a little bit later. But coffee drinkers sometimes, at least, and I would say often, have other bad habits, like, for instance, smoking. We used to think that, coffee carried this risk, but maybe the research is showing that it was these other habits that were the cause of this and not the coffee itself. So why was it so bad? And what's basically changed in the research?
Well, I think you really pointed to something that was confounding the research quite a bit, which was that, for a long time, coffee was associated with smoking. And, it's kind of more recently, actually, that coffee has emerged as such a cultural phenomenon on its own, whereas previously it was more something people did, along with their cigarettes. And people smoked a lot more. And most recently, there was a big study that was published looking at all the data. This just came out in February of this year, 2016, and they were able to do a study on the relationship between coffee drinking and mortality from all causes, and they only looked at non-smokers. They were able to take that out And when they took the smokers out, they saw that there was a clear linear relationship. So up to moderation, which in their study was 5 cups a day of coffee drinking, there was a dose relationship with reduced risk of premature mortality from pretty much all causes, including cardiovascular disease. When they put the smoking back in, they got kind of a nonlinear correlation. So clearly smoking was confounding the data, the relationship. So I think that's what happened, actually.
Now, you've been to Australia, or as we like to say, Straya, and I've been to the States, and a coffee here and there just isn't the same thing. If I wanted what I like, I have to ask for a double latte with extra cream. And that basically gives me what Australians would call a cappuccino. So when researchers are talking about a cup of coffee, what do they mean?
Well, that's actually a good question. So technically they define a cup as a 6-ounce cup, I believe. So it's actually most people who drink a cup of coffee, and I'm using air quotes, are really drinking more like 2 cups because they're typically drinking a mug or, like a coffee to, you don't say to go, carry out cup.
Yep.
Or take away. That's what you say.
Take away, yeah.
Cup. Take away cup, which are much bigger. So really they're talking about, more like 2 cups in the studies. But in reality, all the studies that I've read, and I have a whole file actually on my computer, and I'm just going to tell you that if I look down my list, I've got studies here linking coffee intake to reduce risk of colorectal cancer, biliary cancer, pharyngeal cancer, lung cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. And all of these studies are showing basically that the more coffee you drink, kind of on the realm of 4 cups a day, you start to get significant risk reduction in deaths from these various cancers and all-cause mortality.
You know what interested me is that you have a passion for treating or for supporting cancer patients through their therapy, and indeed for supporting them to live long and happy lives afterwards. What I was interested in was what other things, like for instance, a friend of mine is a cardiac specialist nurse, and she was talking many years ago about when they were trying to look at angiography, they had to tell patients, it wasn't just coffee, but they had to tell people about getting off Coke. They had to tell people about getting off chocolate, tea, but also their herbal teas. Like, for instance, green tea is the common one because they all contain caffeine, and this might have an interaction with the medicines that they were trying to use to image the heart, to slow the heart down. Where I'm going with this is heart disease. Now, what I was interested in is this study, and it's in QJM. I don't know what that stands for, but it's a randomized controlled trial investigating the influence of coffee on heart rate variability in patients with ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction. So when the ST segment is raised after a heart attack, coffee does not affect that. Even though it had some other effects, coffee was found to be safe and not associated with any adverse cardiovascular outcomes. So it's not just cancer. We're looking at other things as well. Even with gout, I read, there was a study there that it said this is the first systemic review on the effects of coffee consumption and serum uric acid. Based on our study, moderate coffee intake might be advocated for primary prevention. So it's really interesting how this has just done this total about face.
Yeah, and I mean, not only, so cardiovascular, let's look at that, and then I want to give you some other conditions that are improved with coffee. But, this cardiovascular linkage is interesting because, of course, if people are highly sensitive to caffeine, like their liver doesn't metabolize or break down caffeine very effectively, they're slow metabolizers, they're going to have a lot of caffeine, they're going to get very jittery from it, and they tend to have elevated systolic blood pressure, which, if they sustain for a period of time, is a risk factor for heart disease. But for people who are not in that category, and that's the minority, so people, the rest of us, when we drink caffeine and from the coffee bean, we're, imbibing a slew of antioxidants and various, acids found in the coffee bean that have pretty strong antioxidant and blood sugar lowering effects. And from our modern understanding of cardiovascular disease, we know that cardiovascular disease is really a disease of inflammation of the arteries and the heart, and that antioxidation is impaired typically. And when people have insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, which is characterized in part by higher levels of blood sugar, they're going to be at greater risk for developing heart disease. So if we think about heart disease from that perspective, we begin to kind of logic out why this would actually reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease instead of increasing it. I think, and then just some other things to throw out there. If we go back and think about coffee as a medicinal plant and how it was used medicinally by the herbalists of old, coffee was prescribed to people who were depressed. And so it has a mood elevating effect. And that is, I think, what most people in modern society term as, I'm not really waking up until I have my cup of coffee. But in fact, it does actually help people with a tendency towards depression or dysthymia. And it is actually associated with lower suicide risk in some studies. Coffee consumption is also, if you think about it from an herbalist perspective, it was also prescribed when people had sluggish bowels or constipation. And we know it's a bowel stimulant, which actually makes a lot of sense as a medicinal therapeutic indication. Think how many people are constipated, reabsorbing all those enterotoxins, contributing to inflammation and creating systemic disease. So even just the bowel motility effect is going to be very far-reaching, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's, if you just think about it I think about all these things as herbs, right? So this herb, which we all tend to like, has a lot of medicinal effects.
I think what's interesting is now not just caffeine, the chemical or the majorly researched chemical from coffee, but whole coffee. Indeed, it was the phenolic agents in coffee that they're now attributing to assisting or reducing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And gastroenterologists in Australia are using coffee as a means to help patients who have NAFLD. Right. I think it's really interesting how this is done about face. One of the interesting things for me is that I spoke to an allergist in Australia, a very well-known guy, Dr. Rob Lobley, and I really, really admire his work. He was telling me that his whole team did the elimination diet, and of course, they got off coffee. And he said the biggest thing getting off coffee was the headaches that you got. I started to question that. I say, well, hang on, you did an elimination diet. It wasn't just getting off coffee. So what part of that was attributed to coffee and what part of that was, quote unquote, a detox, which he doesn't subscribe to that convention. But I thought, that's an interesting thing, that we tend to attribute a bad thing to a certain single agent. We like to do this as humans.
Right. Can
I ask, though, what about, we've seen these bad things in the past being attributed to coffee. And indeed, gout. I mentioned gout. Gout treatment, number one, was getting them off coffee because of the theobromines. Now it shows that it might be actually plausible to be advocated. Has coffee changed, perhaps?
I don't think so, really. I mean, I guess I don't know for sure, but I don't think so. Certainly it's originally from Ethiopia, I believe, is the origin of coffee, and then it has now spread, of course, all over the world, and it's grown all over the world. So I'm sure each origin lends a different biochemical profile to coffee. Maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah,
but
I wonder.
To my knowledge, I don't think it's really changed.
I just wonder because I remember it was probably a decade ago when the coffee and tea companies decided that they would start advocating or start advertising that they were a really good source of antioxidants. And I wonder if maybe the preparation, the manufacture of the coffee beans might have changed in that time, whereas, in the 1950s, 60s, it was get the caffeine. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either. I don't know. I mean, I know one thing that's a little bit different that's available now are these green coffee bean extracts. So then, the young beans that haven't been roasted yet, and they have a really high concentration of chlorogenic acid, which is not found in as high a concentration, still in the roasted bean, but this chlorogenic acid is really potent as a way to stimulate the metabolism of sugar and fat in the body. It's also a very potent antioxidant. There was a study that was in the journal Diabetes, Metabolic Syndrome, and Obesity, and after 12 weeks of a green coffee bean extract, there was significant weight loss. I think the subjects lost about 10% of their overall body weight, and most of that was body fat.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of good research that has linked coffee consumption, just regular coffee now, like 3 to 4 cups again, that kind of often you see that dosage with 25% lower risk of type 2 diabetes, which could again be traced back to these chlorogenic acids and their effect on blood sugar. So, maybe the roasting process has changed and we're preserving more of that chlorogenic acid. I suppose that's a possibility.
Well, you mentioned before about the uses of coffee reducing the risk of certain cancers. I was interested to find that there was a couple of papers where coffee showed an increase in lung cancer, for instance, and an increase in gastric cancer, which surprised me, but that was at a really high dose. Do you know anything about these studies, and can you explain their results at all?
Yeah, there was a study, and it was actually published in 2012 in a journal called Lung Cancer, surprisingly. And they observed a dose-response relationship between coffee consumption and increased risk of lung cancer. And so the more coffee that people drank, the higher their risk of lung cancer. However, as you might imagine, a big confounder in that study was smokers, right?
Yeah, so, the obvious one would be smoking.
It's a hard thing to tease apart. Yeah, hard thing to tease apart there. That same study actually found that green tea consumed at over 7 cups a day reduced the risk of lung cancer. So, I think that there was something indicative of, again, some benefit to these flavonoids found in tea and coffee. But yeah, I think, lung cancer is probably the weakest link in terms of cancers. Yeah. The rest, though, seem pretty strong as a beneficial effect.
What about that one with gastric cancer, with high dose above 6.5 cups a day showing an increase in gastric cancer? That really surprised me.
Yeah, I don't know what that would be either, but I think that that's consistent with the studies. Like the benefit seems to be very dose dependent up till about 4 to 5 cups a day, and then once you get past that, the tightness of the association tends to weaken, and you don't really see as much benefit. So it seems like it's a bit of a positive effect up to 4-ish, 5-ish cups a day, and again, those are the 6-ounce size cups. So I think, as we would imagine, too much of a good thing can become a challenge to the body. And I don't know what it is, maybe there's some effect locally in the GI tract, which has to do more with the acidity or, and the pH balance or reflux or something like that.
Well, I mean, my finger sort of starts to waver towards the microbiome and how we're aberrating it with bad diet. If this was a US population and most of the US population is overweight, it'd be interesting to see what, when you tease out all of this stuff, what part is really attributable to maybe a
increases fat burning. Lowers blood sugar, really improves insulin sensitivity. I mean, all of that got to be so important to people
and
who have
NAFLD,
excess body weight. So and I mean, there's some pretty good studies on looking at the dietary impact of coffee and caffeinated coffee, especially on improving that insulin sensitivity. And it even has been shown that when people eat a high carb meal and they drink coffee, they have less insulin resistance than if they don't drink the coffee. So this is where, people's perhaps poor breakfast choice of having a muffin or, some pastry along with their coffee. At least their coffee is going to help them manage the pastry a little bit.
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. Not advocating that breakfast.
No. You mentioned the epigenetics and some of the nutrigenomics, I guess, before with regards to co-methyltransferase and how people handle coffee, the fast or slow metabolizers. What percentage would be either? What do you see in your practice?
I used to measure it a bit more than I do now, so I don't actually measure it anymore. I mostly ask people, like, if you drink a cup of coffee, do you get wired all day long, or can you drink a cup of coffee in the afternoon? And if you do, does it prevent you from sleeping all night? And so by that I infer, so if they were to answer yes to those questions, I would infer that they're slow metabolizers. And I would say that I think less than 15% that's a bit of a guess, but it's definitely not the norm. Most people, they prefer not to have coffee. It's a little harder for them to sleep, but they don't in the afternoon, but it doesn't prevent them from sleeping is definitely the norm.
Yeah. Whereas the fast metabolizers, they could drink coffee, they're the people they can drink coffee with an evening meal and still get to bed. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they, hardly are affected by coffee at all. They tend to be a bit over consumers actually because they're looking for that alertness factor from
the next
coffee
hit,
and they tend to eat. Yeah. I had an interesting, somebody recommended to me once, I was mentioning that I don't like to take naps during the day because I wake up so groggy. And he said, I got a great strategy for that. I drink a cup of coffee and then I go and I take a nap. And what happens is I go to sleep because coffee doesn't prevent me from falling asleep right away. And when I wake up, all that caffeine's kind of affected my brain by then. 20 minutes later, I wake up and I'm perfectly alert.
So pre-dosing.
Yeah.
That's organization for you.
I'm not a napper still, but yeah, I thought that was a good little tip.
So what about the relevant dose? I remember reading some things that it actually, years ago we used to say, no more than 2 cups a day. Now it seems that it starts at 2 cups and goes up to like 4 cups a day. Is that right? What sort of dose do you tend to advocate?
Yeah, that's about what I do. But again, nobody really drinks a cup of coffee anymore. So really what people are drinking is 2 cups typically to start. And that's what they call a cup of coffee. And so really I say 1 to 2 cups of coffee, which translates into 2 to 4 research cups of coffee.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that's the way to go. There's one important caveat to this, which is we've mentioned some of these other constituents in coffee, which we're implying, I think, have a role to play in the benefit of coffee. And I think that's really important because like energy drinks that extract out the caffeine,
yes,
those are dangerous.
Yes.
And, they're high quantities of caffeine, just like we would imagine. You take a constituent out of its whole food, situation, and now you've got something which is really irritating to the heart, puts blood pressure up, has been implicated in actually some deaths in the United States, especially in teens that are drinking these energy drinks in great quantity or mixing it with alcohol.
And that's the worst.
The implications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. I think that's probably not necessarily but one of the biggest causes of the rise in alcohol-fueled violence is the combination of these caffeine, sugar, huge amount of sugar, and alcohol drinks. Combining it with an alcohol drink, and they're fueled, or they're drunk, and they're wired as well. It's just a nightmarish concoction.
Yeah, and I guess just trying to scratch my brain for anything that would be worth mentioning as a sort of on the downside of coffee, lest we appear too biased. And I guess there is a study that did show that people who were already hypertensive, so they already had high blood pressure, and they were all elderly. Yep. When in this case, it was over the age of 60 or so. When they drank coffee, their blood pressure actually did go up. Yep. And that kind of makes sense too to me, just from a physiological level. Because if you think about somebody who's over 60 who's hypertensive, they probably have some pretty good atherosclerosis, pretty well established, so that they've got hardening of the arteries, less flexibility. And now you're giving them a stimulant which is going to at least temporarily vasoconstrict. So I think you would expect to see higher blood pressure in those individuals. So that might be one group of people to mitigate the quantity a bit, maybe keep it at the 2 cups a day range. So
that leads into my next question, and that was the other caveat, I guess, and that is the interactions with certain meds, especially things like heart medications, blood pressure medications are the probably the most volatile, if you like. But what about things like psychiatric medications? I mean, a huge amount of psychiatric patients are coffee drinkers. But what if you changed your diet?
Most of them are, right?
Yeah. But what if they changed their diet and were already on an antipsychotic medication of some sort or an antidepressant, and then they started to intake coffee?
I think that should be watched and might have something to do with, some psychotic or mood disturbances in those people. Certainly people that are prone to or have conditions that are characterized by overactivity of part of their, central neurological system. Because caffeine is a really strong neurostimulant. So I think that has been documented, actually. I mean, the clinical relevance, certainly a good thing to consider. I think the clinical relevance is limited because, boy, from what I've seen, most people on psychiatric medications and psychiatric institutions, coffee is everywhere.
Yeah. And I guess that would be the same with heart meds as well. Most people are already intaking coffee as a lifestyle thing. And so they have that lifestyle issue. They have heart disease because of overweight and not exercising enough and whatever factors. And then they start their medication. So the baseline is already there for their, not just caffeine intake, but their coffee intake, yeah?
Right. Yep, I would agree with that. And I think when we're talking about this, I just have to go back to this role of coffee as an antioxidant, which I think antioxidant / hypoglycemic, because if we think about all of the chronic diseases that, we're seeing in people, we can definitely name both of those things, oxidative stress and some degree of hyperglycemia or insulin resistance underlying these conditions. So, to me, this really tells us why coffee is so critical. And maybe this is why we didn't see these strong studies, in the 1950s, 40s, where the rate of insulin resistance was less. Stress was actually less in some ways, except at wartime. But I think that, in general, we're a different population now. So the study group has changed.
Yes, absolutely.
And our diets are so antioxidant depleted. I mean, in the United States, one of the most common sources of antioxidants is ketchup or tomato sauce, as you say, and coffee.
Yeah.
So, our bodies are desperate for anything.
Yeah. There's an old axiom of naturopathic practice, and that is, coffee in moderation is fine, but if you intake high amounts of coffee over a long period of time, that it actually, quote unquote, wastes your adrenals and gives you adrenal fatigue. But is there any real evidence for that? And what other messages, as a last thing, would you impart to practitioners to care for their patients with regarding coffee?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. So I don't think there's any direct evidence to support this. And I think it also goes back to when we say adrenal fatigue, most people who appear to be fatigued, and we trace it back to their stress response, are actually in a hypercortisolemic state.
Yep.
So their adrenal glands are actually overproducing cortisol, not fatigue. So we've misnamed that phase in most people. And does caffeine increase cortisol levels? It can. So people who are feeling the effects of having too much cortisol, one of which is fatigue, poor sleep, a myriad of other things, will tend to go to coffee to try to boost themselves up and get through the day. And so I think in that sense, they're using the wrong crutch and in fact missing the opportunity. So I do think it's a detriment. When those people stop drinking coffee, they often feel worse and then a lot better. And I think that's because they've sort of taken their foot off the gas pedal a little bit. And when they give up caffeine, they can't help but reevaluate their life patterns in general. So I think it leads to other lifestyle changes. And just frankly, the lack of caffeine probably does drop that cortisol a little bit in those people, which is going to help them physiologically.
I think that just to illustrate that point regarding using it as looking for the wrong crutch, there was a patient who had marked blood loss from gastrointestinal lesions, but obviously felt tired from that because he was anemic, severely anemic, and was using caffeine to stimulate himself up to be able to continue through the day. Obviously, coffee then is the wrong crutch. You need to be treating the cause. And eventually this person got the correct treatment. But it was just an interesting thing how people will rely on a now Band-Aid, if you like, to get them through the day.
Yeah, that's a great example. And the other thing that I've seen, we know that coffee stimulates the dopamine system in the brain, which is the reward system. So that system, unfortunately, habituates really easily. So when we when we increase dopamine, it takes more to get that same dopamine kind of surge, which if people are, kind of tired, they're exhausted with life, they're stressed out, they really crave that dopamine. Their brain just does almost anything for it. So those people will they're already pushing themselves beyond their means. And then they're going to probably be drinking more coffee to get that dopamine surge to kind of reward themselves, help them feel that little bit of euphoria in their day. But that too is just going to accelerate their problem. So I think for those people, certainly these really high stress, go, early morning till late night type of people are probably not the best candidates for high coffee consumption.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I like to see around the place now is how coffee is changing in that, or the preparation of coffee is changing. So people are becoming rather particular in their type of coffee that they like. So it's not just a cappuccino anymore. They're now looking at the ristrettos, the macchiatos, but also they're looking at the organic types of coffee, and they might be adding ghee and medium chain triglycerides, for instance. So they're really turning into this quite healthful type of herbal drink. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And that's actually, I think, the organic coffee is something that I do counsel my patients about. Non-organic coffee is you're basically extracting that bean every morning when you make your coffee through, with water, and you're going to extract out water-soluble pesticides. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to drink organic as often as we can. And I'm so glad to see more and more of that available and tasting good.
So as a last little roundup for our practitioners, 2 to 4 cups a day for most people unless they can't metabolize. What other messages?
Yeah, I would say that, I think for me, the bottom line is this, that people come to us looking for help with diet changes.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, we have the responsibility to focus their efforts on the most impactful changes possible, the things that are going to be most useful and really avert their current state of health towards more health and avert their risk for disease. So with that perspective, I think taking people's coffee away shouldn't be number one on the list unless they're in this category that we talked about where they're, really using it as the wrong crutch. Then I think it could be a very helpful lifestyle intervention. But I think, if we sort of think, okay, this is an antioxidant, this is actually maybe one of the components in their diet that's helpful, what else can I look at that would really help, how close to the Mediterranean diet pattern is this person's diet? How many vegetables are they eating on a daily basis? What's their water intake like? I mean, those are the things that I think we can kind of look at, because when we vilify foods, we can get ourselves caught in a little bit of a trap, and we miss opportunities to make really impactful changes in people's lives.
Dr. Lise Alschuler, once again, you take us through some salient points that can help practitioners help support their patients with practical, sensible lifestyle modification. And I got to say, I just truly love your work and really admire what you do for people. You're an amazing human being. So thank you for joining us on FX Medicine today.
Well, my pleasure, and it takes one to know one.
You're so sweet. This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today on FX Medicine, please engage with us and let us know what further topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in contact with us through our website, fxmedicine.com.au, or look for FX Medicine in your favourite social media platform. You can also rate and review us on iTunes, and we'd really like to thank those who have already rated us. It's through your continued support that enables us to bring you current, complex and relevant topics to enhance your practice of natural medicine.